Institutions look at infrastructure and ask, can this system handle scale? Retail chases narratives. Institutions chase reliability. And when those two worlds eventually collide, the repricing doesn't happen gradually. It happens suddenly. That's why understanding positioning matters before price reacts. This isn't about predicting the next pump. It's about recognizing when a network stops being experimental and starts becoming structural. BAR isn't dominating headlines. XRP isn't moving in straight lines. But beneath the surface, something more important is happening. Infrastructure is being selected. And once systems are selected, markets usually react late. Most people will only notice when the price moves. But by then, the positioning has already been done. That's the difference between speculation and structure. And that's why XRP and HBAR deserve to be analyzed not as coins, but as components of a system that is quietly forming in real time. And that brings me to XRP, because XRP keeps coming up in conversations, but usually in the wrong way. Most people obsess over price targets. How high can it go? When do I sell? Where is the top? That is not how capital thinks. What actually matters is what happens after an asset becomes valuable, and what options open up once something stops being purely speculative and starts being structurally important. Because when an asset reaches that stage, selling is rarely the most interesting move. And just to be crystal clear before we go further, this is not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to buy or sell. This is educational. I'm just walking you through how I personally think about assets, liquidity, and wealth mechanics, so you can start seeing the game the way the wealthy see it. Now, let's start with the foundation. One of the biggest misunderstandings in personal finance is the idea that income equals wealth. Income is temporary. Ownership is enduring. Liquidity feels powerful because it's visible. You can spend it, move it, show results with it. But liquidity is also fragile. Once it's used, it's gone. Once it's taxed, it shrinks. Once it's spent, it has to be recreated. Ownership works differently. Ownership doesn't need to move to create value. It doesn't need to be converted to be useful. And it doesn't disappear just because you access its benefits. That's why wealthy people don't rush to sell appreciating assets. Not because they're emotionally attached, but because they understand something most retail investors never learn. Selling collapses optionality. When you sell, you make a permanent decision. You choose one outcome and eliminate every other possible use of that asset going forward. That's retail behavior. That's not an insult. It's just a description of how most people are trained. Buy something, wait, sell it, repeat. But once an asset reaches a certain scale, it stops being a trade and starts functioning like infrastructure on your personal balance sheet. At that point, the question shouldn't be, how do I cash out? The question becomes, what does this asset allow me to do without giving it up? Because ownership gives you leverage, it gives you access, it gives you options that liquidity never will. Liquidity is a moment. Ownership is a position. And when people say, what's the point if you never sell? What they're really saying is they've only been taught one way money can work. Selling is one function of an asset. It's often the least efficient function. Once you understand that, you stop chasing exits and you start designing systems. And that's where XRP becomes interesting, not because of price targets, but because of what becomes possible when ownership is preserved and liquidity is accessed in smarter ways. That shift is the difference between short-term gains and long-term financial independence. So let's talk about turning XRP into spendable power without selling it. Because the goal isn't to convert assets into cash. The goal is to convert assets into access. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable. Not because it's complicated, but because it challenges conditioning. Most people have been taught that the only way to enjoy the value of something is to sell it. That might be true for small assets. It's not true once assets reach scale. At scale, assets don't need to be sold to be useful. They need to be positioned. Look at how institutions operate. They don't liquidate valuable holdings to fund operations. They collateralize them. They borrow against them. They keep the asset intact while liquidity does the work. Same principle here. If an asset is appreciating and recognized as valuable, it can sit on your balance sheet and still provide spendable power. You're not extracting value by destroying ownership. You're extracting value by accessing liquidity temporarily. And this matters because selling triggers taxes. Selling locks in timing risk. Selling deletes future upside. Selling removes the asset from your financial ecosystem. Borrowing doesn't do that. A loan is not income, so it isn't taxed like income. Borrowing against an asset doesn't require giving up ownership. And if the underlying asset grows over time, the relative weight of the loan becomes lighter. That's why debt in the hands of disciplined asset holders behaves differently than debt in the hands of consumers. Consumer debt funds lifestyle. Strategic debt funds systems. This is the moment where XRP stops being something you hope goes up and starts functioning like a balance sheet asset. If XRP reaches a point where it's broadly recognized as structurally important, used, relied upon, integrated, then its role changes. It becomes something you can stand on. And liquidity sourced from an asset like that can be deployed intentionally, not recklessly, not emotionally, not intentionally. You can deploy that liquidity to acquire income-producing businesses. You can fund ventures that generate cash flow. You can invest in systems that support your life without requiring constant attention. And here's the key point. The asset remains intact the entire time. You're not dismantling the foundation to live in the house. You're using the foundation to support the structure above it. This is how people end up with lifestyles that don't match their visible income. Because income isn't the driver, access is. And over time, when assets appreciate and borrowed capital is deployed productively, the structure starts feeding itself. That is not speculation. That is balance sheet mechanics. Once you understand that layer, you stop obsessing over selling your highest upside assets, because selling becomes the least interesting option. But access alone isn't the end goal. The next layer is where things compound. What happens when the asset itself becomes productive? So let's talk about making XRP productive without losing control. And this applies to any high-conviction asset with long-term relevance. At some point, simply holding an asset may not be the most intelligent use of it. That doesn't mean you sell it. It means you stop letting it sit idle. There's a big difference between speculation and productivity. Speculation depends on timing. Productivity depends on structure. When an asset becomes usable inside financial systems, it gains the ability to do work without being liquidated. That's where people mess up because they hear words like yield or lending and instantly think risk. But productivity doesn't automatically mean recklessness. It simply means the asset is no longer passive. Think about mature capital systems. Money doesn't sit still. It circulates. It provides liquidity. It supports transactions. And it earns something for being available. If XRP becomes deeply tied to settlement infrastructure, then liquidity itself becomes valuable. Not ownership transfer, but liquidity access. That distinction matters. If institutions, rails, or platforms need XRP temporarily to facilitate movement, then value isn't only in holding it. Value is also in allowing access under controlled conditions. That's where lending and liquidity provisioning enter the picture, not as a casino play, but as a structural function. And I'm emphasizing structural, because crypto has trained people to treat everything like a trade. But there is a real transition point when an asset moves from hype to infrastructure. When you lend, you're not giving your asset away. You're maintaining ownership while allowing temporary use. And when that use is tied to real economic activity, the asset can generate return without being consumed. This is where mindset changes again. Because when an asset is appreciating and productive, time behaves differently. You stop waiting for price to validate you. The asset starts validating itself. But productivity requires discipline. Duration matters. Counterparty matters. Exposure matters. The goal isn't squeezing maximum percentage. The goal is keeping the asset intact, useful, and alive. People who don't understand this either avoid it completely or overreach. Neither builds longevity, but when done correctly, productivity adds a second dimension to wealth. Appreciation drives growth. Productivity drives sustainability. And once those two layers exist together, the conversation moves beyond income and into systems. Which brings us to the part most people never connect: the flywheel. Wealth doesn't behave in straight lines. Most people are taught a linear model: earn, save, invest, sell. That model can create stability. It doesn't create freedom. Wealth behaves in loops, not lines. When you understand that, you stop asking, "How much does this make?" and start asking, "What does this feed?" Here's what the flywheel looks like structurally. You have an asset you own that can appreciate over time. That asset gives you access to liquidity without liquidation. That liquidity is deployed into something that produces real cash flow. That cash flow supports your life, reinvestment, or both. And none of that requires dismantling the original asset. That's the flywheel. The mistake people make is treating each step like it exists independently. In reality, each layer reinforces the next. Borrowed liquidity isn't the end goal. It's the bridge. Productivity isn't the end goal. It's the stabilizer. Cash flow is where the system becomes livable. And that's how people build lives that aren't fragile, because their lifestyle isn't dependent on selling at the perfect moment. It's supported by systems that keep moving whether markets are exciting or boring. This is where XRP, if it reaches structural relevance, becomes more than a holding. It becomes a foundation. You don't need XRP to pay your bills directly. You need it to support the systems that do. Cash flow assets don't need to be flashy. They need to be dependable. Businesses, media, real estate, licensing, equity stakes. Those aren't glamorous topics online, but they quietly fund freedom. And the flywheel doesn't have to spin fast. It has to spin stable. Stability creates patience. Patience creates compounding. Compounding allows time to do what effort never can. This is also where efficiency becomes natural. When capital is deployed into productive systems, expenses exist, depreciation exists, write-offs exist. Those aren't the goal. They're a byproduct of structure. The real advantage is that your lifestyle is no longer tied to liquidation. You don't need to time tops. You don't need to panic on pullbacks. You don't need constant stimulation. You're operating from a position, not a trade. And once the flywheel exists, wealth becomes quieter, less reactive, less emotional, less urgent. That's when people stop asking, "How rich can I get?" and start planning, "How long can I stay free?" And I'll add this. When you start thinking in systems, you also start thinking differently about execution, custody, and how you handle size. Retail platforms train people to click buttons. That's not how serious capital moves. Slippage matters. Privacy matters. Execution matters. Planning matters. That's why people who are truly building long-term positions think about structure before they think about hype. They build systems before they need them, not after the fact. And that leads to my main point. This conversation isn't random. It's meant to sober you. Too many people are operating on a temporary time frame. They're thinking about this week, this candle, this pump, this pullback. They're not thinking about long-term positioning. They're not thinking about legacy. They're thinking about right now. And when you really think about it, that's immature financial behavior. People will finance consumption they can't afford, but they won't study wealth mechanics that can change their entire future. If you're still here listening, you're not here for entertainment. You're here because you actually care about your future. And that matters, because we're in a different environment now. When regulators, institutions, and infrastructure bodies all start paying attention to the same asset class at the same time, it's not because they suddenly got curious. It's because the old framework is becoming inefficient for what comes next. Liquidity stress exposes weakness. Settlement friction exposes inefficiency. Regulatory confusion exposes outdated assumptions. That's when alternatives stop being theoretical and start being evaluated seriously. Most people get distracted by headlines, enforcement actions, court cases, political statements. I want you to step back and ask the bigger question. Why are these conversations happening at all? Financial systems do not redesign themselves unless they have to. When infrastructure becomes the topic, it's usually because the old infrastructure can't keep up with scale, speed, or complexity. That's when assets tied to settlement, liquidity, and movement get viewed differently than assets that exist purely for speculation. So timing matters, not for trading, for understanding. When an asset moves from the margins into the infrastructure conversation, its role changes. It becomes something systems account for. And when systems account for something, ownership matters more than excitement. That's why the wealth question becomes incomplete if it's only, how do I make money? The better question becomes, how do assets function inside a changing system? Do they require constant exits? Do they sit idle? Or do they support liquidity, access, and continuity? If you remember nothing else from this video, remember this. Wealth isn't built by being right once. It's built by designing systems that don't depend on perfect timing. Selling has a place. Liquidity has a place. Profit-taking has a place. But those are tools, not strategies. When people build their financial life around exits, they stay reactive. When they build around ownership, access, and structure, they gain control. Assets are not lottery tickets. They are leverage points. And once you learn how to preserve ownership while accessing liquidity, productivity, and cash flow, money stops being something you chase and becomes something you manage. That's the difference between reacting to markets and positioning within them. If this resonated with you, if you care more about long-term control than short-term excitement, then hit the like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown, and tell me in the comments what you're building toward. I want to hear your plan, your goals, your timeline, because the more we train ourselves to think in systems, the harder it becomes for volatility to shake us out of our future. Stay sharp, stay disciplined, and I'll see you in the next one. Institutions look at infrastructure and ask, can this system handle scale? Retail chases narratives. Institutions chase reliability. And when those two worlds eventually collide, the repricing doesn't happen gradually. It happens suddenly. That's why understanding positioning matters before price reacts. This isn't about predicting the next pump. It's about recognizing when a network stops being experimental and starts becoming structural. H-bar isn't dominating headlines. XRP isn't moving in straight lines. But beneath the surface, something more important is happening. Infrastructure is being selected. And once systems are selected, markets usually react late. Most people will only notice when the price moves. But by then, the positioning has already been done. That's the difference between speculation and structure. And that's why XRP and H-bar deserve to be analyzed not as coins, but as components of a system that is quietly forming in real time.